What a great pleasure it is to welcome Chris Powici back to the University of Dundee for the second time. Chris came and read as part of our Dundee Book Festival a few years ago when we had a spot called Poem and a Piece, a lunchtime poetry spot, and it was just wonderful having you read from your work then. And Chris is here wearing many hats, and I think as well as talking to him about his poems, and in particular his latest collection, The Weight of Light, that came out spring?
Well, it's still coming out.
Right, okay.
It's a bit shy,
okay,
but it'll be fully out.
But
it's out.
Okay, but as well as talking about the recent poems, we're also going to want to talk to Chris about his role as editor of Northwards, because, of course, we all love Northwards here at Dundee, and we contribute to Northwards, and we read it, and it's very much part of our student programme, so it's lovely to have you here wearing that hat. In addition, Chris is a teacher of creative writing at the Open University and at Stirling, where we all hear wonderful things from students about the quality of teaching and the quality of feedback that you give students. So, and also, finally, as a poet and a wonderful reader of his own work. So a great pleasure to have him here. And I think, first of all, a warm welcome. What if I could start with a personal story, which is before I met Chris in the flesh and before I started reading your work, we had some kind of email exchange.
We did, I remember, yes.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I've got a PhD, I confess, but it's not in creative writing. I got one of the academic ones, and it was on wolves and literature and wildness and things of that nature. And you got interested in wolves as well.
Yeah.
And so we exchanged about things lupine.
Yeah. And I've been hunting back in my memory bank to figure out how that happened, and it was quite an ongoing discussion for a number of emails.
Yeah, it was. It was kind of... the funny thing is that I've loved wolves, and I love writing my PhD about wolves. But since then, I've barely written about wolves at all, really.
Really?
But oddly enough. And I started writing about deer.
Yes.
And Rory Watson at Stirling said, well, it's obviously... or somebody at Stirling said, you're obviously now figuring with the victim. You've had enough of wolves, so you've just moved on to deer. But no, I still like wolves.
Yeah, well, I think that's a nice way of introducing the kind of poet you are, because there's definitely something about the world you inhabit that takes note of these wild places and spaces within our consciousness, and also an awareness of what it is to be human and interacting with that. Would you like to just talk a little bit about your poetic sensibility?
Ooh, it's almost pre-poetic. It's that thing about animals, that fascination with things that are maybe wild or on the edge. I think it's just been there since I was a kid. And the same with a lot of children. I think share that with a lot of children. I didn't really put it aside. And it partly begins with fairy tales, I think, for a lot of people of my age and where I'm from in the world, in Europe, Northern Europe. I mean, the landscapes are fairy tales. There's forests and mountains, and that are so alluring. And I think I grew up on the edge of a town, so I was always kind of aware that one side I had the houses and the shops and even a few factories and things like that. But the other side, there was quite a lot of, still is a bit, of open land, of common land and woods. And that fascination with just those things that are just kind of over the doorstep, down the lane, a bit beyond. It's just a bit beyond. And how we fit into that. And then when I began reading, I think seriously as well, as I began to write, but I began to see how many writers themselves sort of look at that boundary as well, which is always shifting. It's not a stable thing, but and how we bring the wild into our houses as sort of we go out into it as well. So it's still there. I still find it very exciting, actually. That
these kinds of boundaries are very available to us in Scotland too, aren't they?
They are. I mean, we live, Henning and I, in Dunblane, and so we're less than an hour on a train to Edinburgh or Glasgow, but just get the bike out of the shed and I'm in the hills. It's wonderful, yeah.
And Chris, have you always written poetry? You've said that that's where that kind of mindset came from. With that came prose as well, or has it always
Not
been
much
poem?
prose. I've written a few short stories and a few essays and papers and that kind of thing, and the odd review. But mainly it's always been poetry, and I can't put my finger on why exactly that is. Right? Why poetry rather than story? I think it's because it's we blame it on the romantic poets and the lyric moment. I think it's just about poetry that's in the moment, and the record of it. Poetry is just particularly good at recording a few seconds.
Yeah.
And I think that's what appealed to me, is how much life there is in a few seconds of time sometimes. And I think that's what poetry for me. And also, very prosaically, when I was about 7, I wrote a poem and showed it to my mum and dad. And, they liked it. So my vanity was kind of ignited as well at that stage. So yeah, but it's always kind of been there since I was, certainly since my teens, especially. I kind of always knew it was there.
Well, I love this idea of lighting up a moment and the poem allowing that being a space at that moment. So maybe now we should have a few of the poems.
Okay, yeah. I'll start off with some poems about animals. In fact, I say that. I write very few poems that don't include animals. But I'll do a few. And you mentioned the question of boundaries between the human world and the animal world and where they meet. And so I'll begin with a poem about deer. It's just called Deer. In the dawn light, on the cold hill, the deer are running. The thud of their hooves on the bed of the stream is the drum that rocks the roots of the birch and the wind that shakes the birch tree's leaves. Rain is their tribe song. Rain is their robe. Snow is the dust of the bones of deer falling to earth. And earth is the dark, deep silence of things, where you dream yourself human, alive, watching the red deer running on the wall of a cave. That poem obviously refers to... I've not been to Le Sceau or any of those places, but I suppose that would be top... If I was ever to construct anything like a bucket list, which I'm kind of in principle against, but if I was ever to write one, Le Sceau would be high up, just because the idea that people just kind of entered into the lives of animals through art, and just fascinates me. Another poem about it's about an otter. I went through most of my life, over 50 years of my life, without ever seeing an otter in the wild. And then, they happen. They come along in droves. Well, I don't think you get droves of otters, do you really? But I certainly saw a couple in the same week. And the first time I saw an otter, I've written several poems about it, actually, was off the coast of Arran. And so this one's called The Otter Goddess. The otter goddess won't hear our prayers, cares more about the sway and feel of kelp against her belly than whether we believe in her or not. She'd sooner eat gull than have anything to do with love or forgiveness. She can't even tell herself apart from the sinewy crab huntress her presence inhabits. All she knows is grace. Cool thrill of tail flick and fur glitter as she surges up the green depths to sashay on the swell, and guillemots dive about her, and death is another time. And so it's always been, I suppose, it's almost kind of slightly religious attitude going on there with animals. And I think that what you said about lighting up a moment, poetry for me, I suppose, is to try and get back that moment somehow, and make it bigger. Go into the depths of the moment. A small one about animals. I write. I said we're quite lucky where we live. We've got deer and pheasants and all the usual things. We're also quite lucky, and there's quite a lot of hares. And normally if you see a hare, because they're so different from rabbits, the way they run, but normally a hare will see you and just charge in the opposite direction, gallop away. And once I was out on the bike and this hare didn't. And this is the poem, The Hare. The hare leaps out of the yellowing May gorse, lollops down tractor ruts, almost to the gate, and just sits there, all bristle and haunch, king of the grass and all this gorse-bright earth, giving me its dark, god-eyed stare. I keep calling animals gods, don't I? I'm just beginning to notice.
Something's going on.
Yeah, something is going on there. And birds. I hope to do an East of Scotland poem, as I'm in Dundee. And one of the places that I've only ever visited once or twice, but go through it on the train quite a lot, is Montrose. And is anybody from Montrose knows it? Right. You probably are accustomed to it, being from Montrose. When I was in Montrose, about this time of year, a bit later in the year, it's just the sound of geese all the time. All the time, this kind of marvellous kind of cacophony of geese. And so I just thought it was amazing. And I wrote this poem when I was in Montrose, based on the geese, but also how the people seem to be. So, in October in Montrose, a narrow, leaf-stained street. A woman in a blue coat stands beside a garden wall, listening to the raw, salt-throated cries of 40,000 pink-footed geese surge across the mud flats into every lane and venel of the darkening town. A vast estuarine chorus, yelling its brute alleluia to the trees and houses, shaking the very air. And then the woman lights a cigarette and walks calmly on, as if the holy hollering of geese is just a noise the universe happens to make in October in Montrose, as if she has a million gods to choose from.
You're absolutely right. The gods are present in these poems.
Yeah, it's. My own religious views are pretty much agnostic, I guess, but there is a sense in which any ground can be kind of sort of hallowed, I guess.
But in a way, Chris, this leads me on to my next question, because in a sense, is there something about the poetic tradition that you're occupying, reaching back into that romantic one, where there was something sacred about animals and the world and things that weren't fully kenned by the human mind?
I think so, but I think also what I'm interested in is we're in the romantic tradition. I'm not going to try and put myself against Wordsworth or Keats or any of those guys, but I think what you see very often is this kind of it's a kind of competition between the imagination and nature to see who comes out on top.
Right, yes.
Especially in Shelley,
Yeah.
The Skylark's fantastic and wonderful, but by the end of the poem, Shelley's even more wonderful. But they do. You're right. They kind of they put nature into a kind of sacred space. But what I think is, and what for me is the overlap, really, between the human and natural worlds, so that the sacred space, which for the Romantics would often be Mont Blanc, or a river, or the west wind, or something big and huge and dramatic and so on, is I think for the more modern sensibility, and John Burnside does this as well, I mean Kathleen Jamie does it, and lots of poets do it now, is to look for that sense of the other and that presence much closer to home. You know, within the house, within the garden, within the doors, down the road, down the lane. And I think it's to kind of like almost kind of descale it.
Right, yes.
In a way. Because rather than kind of the vast romantic sublime of nature, is to bring it closer to home, make it more intimate.
It's there in your lovely line, holy hollering of geese, isn't it? The kind of total fusing of that other world and the human perception of it. Yeah. And in that moment, there's a flare of the sacred.
Yes. I don't trust people who don't look up at skeins of geese. It's like amazing. You're standing at bus stops and suddenly a few hundred geese fly above you. That is simply quite incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me then, that's an interesting remark about your place within the Romantic tradition, but who would you say, and you've mentioned Burnside, who would you say were your first big influences when you were setting up your poetic stall?
That's quite reasonably simple question. When I first got a yen to write poetry, it was terrible. It was awful, and that was because I blame Yeats, because I tried to write a bit, because I thought what Yeats wrote was what poetry is supposed to look like, and it's been a lot of Yeats's stuff. Some of it's really difficult and so on, but some of it's brilliant and gorgeous and so finely wrought. And I couldn't do it. Nobody could do it, really, because it's Yeats. And then I didn't really know much about modern poetry, and I was about 16. And then Penguin used to do a series of European modern poets. And I can't remember which shop I was in, but there was one on special offer, and it contained two poets, a Finnish poet who I can't really remember, and the modern poet was Thomas Tranströmer. Right. And I didn't fully get everything that Thomas Tranströmer, who's the Swedish poet who died just a year or so ago, but I suddenly saw that poetry didn't have to be like Yeats to be poetry, and that what he was saying was important, but it was said so modestly and quietly. That I don't think I write like him at all, but it did open my eyes to how poetry could be. And then I got to, I'm a bit of a poetry junkie. I buy lots of it and read lots of it, modern poetry especially. And then as time passed, I became obviously more aware of people like Seamus Heaney, Michael Longley, lots of Irish poets, but also I think sometimes some American poets, and just that ease of voice, that trusting to the vernacular, you trust your vernacular voice as a vehicle for poetry. Yeah. And I think I'm still learning that, but I think that's what...
But that's beautifully put. We've just been exploring in our MLit class today, haven't we? This idea that a poem doesn't necessarily have to feel like a poem. It doesn't necessarily have to come freighted with all of that glory. It doesn't have to come trailing clouds of glory. But can, as you just said, be about the vernacular, the thing that's easily spoken.
There's a friend of mine, Richie McCaffrey's, a very fine young poet. He put it once, he said, poetry, poetic language for him is ordinary language enchanted.
Beautiful.
So
that's lovely.
It's kind of like to get that feel for the vernacular, but it has to have that little frisson of enchantment somewhere in it.
Well, that leads beautifully to my next question, which was, because again in our class we've been talking about this idea of paying attention, and by reporting closely those things that are seen, art may come of that. When you're making a poem, do you start with an observation? Do you start with an idea?
Start either with an image or a phrase. And as Robert Frost used to say, you don't know what the poem's going to... You write the poem to find out what it is you're going to say. And so I start... I have a notion that, when I heard those geese in Montrose, I knew somehow I was going to write the poem, but I didn't know what I was going to say about that. So I knew what the subject was, And very often I'll know the kind of I know what the concrete subject of the poem will be.
Right.
I think a lot of the time. But what the theme of that is, that's going to kind of like run underneath
Come from that.
Yeah, I'm never sure until I've written the poem. And you know that you're being prompted by something sometimes. Sometimes things happen in life, you know, or death. You know that's prompting you to make something from it. But you still don't know the poem itself is a journey for the writer.
You're working your way into that.
Yeah, and then you get those phrases that just seem to hit you, and that's great. And the rest of it, you know, that's lovely. And but sometimes then you're just playing trial and error with images and phrases, and gradually you're writing the poem and hope it emerges. It's a bit like brass rubbing, I suppose.
That's a nice image. We might hold on to that one in our classes. We're rubbing our brass to see how the image is going to emerge.
Yeah, and I think also that sense of, I mean, that's a close observation. I'm not a trained ornithologist or anything like that. I don't see it with quite such a keen eye as an ornithologist would, or a zoologist. But I do think that for any kind of writing, actually, not just poetry, is that it's not just a way of reporting back what you've seen or experienced. It's a way of engaging with it. It's kind of like language as another sense, in a way, which helps you to understand and apprehend and engage with people and things in the world. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, let's have some more poems. Please.
Okay, I'll change the tone a wee bit, and perhaps I'll bring it a bit lighter as well for now, and then we'll get back to the heavy stuff. I cycle quite a bit, these are I sometimes write about things I encounter on bike rides. So I was up near Ullapool once, and there's a lighthouse north of Ullapool, a little place called Rue, and this is about the cycle ride to Rue in a May bike ride. All day long, a raw, eyeball freezing wind screaming down the coast, too brute cold to stand more than 20 minutes at the Rue Lighthouse, watching the gannets wheel and dive before you're pedalling back up the hill, heavy and hunched into mean blasts of sleety rain, when a weasel pokes its pointy, fierce head through the bars of a castle grid, wild and ridiculous as a prize-winning slimmer escaping Alcatraz. So you brake, twist round in the saddle, catch a blear of arse and tail hurtling into the gorse, and on the other side of Loch Broom, the sheer, heathery mass of Ben Goblach, rising through wind-torn cloud into utter light, so real, so high, so like the only mountain. Great voice. So real, so high, so like the only mountain that has ever been. Suddenly, shall I just continue in this voice? Suddenly you want this shitty bastard, no spring at all, to stay and stay and stay. Right. Thank you. I was obviously
we all need to clear our throats now.
Yeah, I was more moved by that poem than I thought I was going to be. I love. I wrote a poem. I won't read this, but I wrote a poem about some graves on Skye. It took me ages to write, much longer. It was only a little poem. It took me ages to write this damn poem. Actually, I quite liked the poem. I got the damn poem. It took me quite a long time. And then came the antidote poem. It's on Kerrera, which is the island across from Oban. And it's just called On Kerrera. On Kerrera at Shell Bay, among seaweeds and stones, I'm looking across the Firth of Lorne to Lismore and the Morven Hills, and thinking about a poem I've been trying to write, describing some graves on Skye, when a cormorant breaks, black and gleaming through the low waves, and for a cold and beautiful second, I can't remember a thing. Another poem some poems happen for the oddest reasons. And I was at Stirling railway station once, and years ago, and they had a poster advertising ScotRail with a picture of a ticket guy, a beaming ticket guy, and it said, "Meet Henry" or something. And so I decided to write a poem about him, except I called him Jeff, because it rhymes better. This is Jeff. A shy man, 40-ish, with thick black hair, likes a bet and works on the railways, checking tickets between Ayr and Glasgow. Has an ex-wife and daughter living in Dundee, and girlfriend, Jan, who works at the bookies, wears cut-off jeans, and has a way of saying, Jeff, that makes his name seem like a breath of summer wind, and who stays with him most weekends at his council maisonette near the retail park, where there are 37 Duke Ellington CDs stacked beside the stereo and a photograph of Kim, his daughter, hanging next to a watercolour print of Shergar on the lounge wall, and where it's a cold January morning, and he's standing at the kitchen door shaking the breadboard free of crumbs for the blue tits in his frozen garden, when one of them flutters to the shed roof and beats the snowflakes from its wings until it's more blizzard than bird, a blur of white in the dead grey air, while Jeff just stands there, spilling crumbs from the breadboard, shivering and struck by the suddenness of love for different bodies, different things. The other thing, my little wee fascination, it's almost something I suppose I should I kind of confess to, is I watch science documentaries on the telly sometimes, Horizon, and the ones that I like often are the ones about theoretical physics and quantum physics. And I watch these things, I think it's just great, absolutely wonderful, it's so fascinating. And then afterwards, it's just like a dream that you don't understand. What on earth are they talking about? And so I watched one of these, and it was about neutrinos. And they're these tiny particles, the littlest things that anybody's ever discovered. And apparently, as we sit here, millions of neutrinos are just flowing through us. They're just pouring out of the sun and stars all around and flowing through us. So I wrote a poem about that, and then I thought it's got to look like neutrinos, so it kind of looks like that on the page. It looks like prose, so it's just constant. And so I'll read that. So it's a bit. There's no punctuation either. So I better have some more water.
I'm going to give you mine
too.
It's
all right.
I have some left, so you should have that.
So the poem's called All the Time Billions. All the time, billions of almost nothings passing right through us. It would take 4 light years travelling through solid lead for a neutrino to notice anything else in the universe actually existed. So this holy palaver of skin, bone, hair, etc. is less than mist. And the migrations of Geese, Plato's head, Bach, fugues, aspirin, the difference engine, rainforests, and the Paris metro, barely more than the sheen of dust on a bat's wing. Who knows, maybe even you, yes, you with your blue northern eyes and memories of the sea, are flowing through this poem, wrapped and quantumly beyond its trembling nest of sounds, and are wrought of the very stuff of light, improbable and utter.
Ooh. I think that needs a clap.
Thank you. We'll pause there.
And some more water.
Yes, pause for a little while there.
Gosh, this is just so lovely having you, Chris. It's a treat. Tell us a little. We spoke in your introduction. You're a busy guy and you've got a lot going on. How do you fit the poems in? And can you tell us a little bit about your writing process altogether?
Yeah, I'm really sorry for the prose. I'm so relieved I'm not a novelist because it would be so hard. I think how you do it, or Helen, my partner, manages to find time to write prose. God, I think poems are great because poems kind of click over in the back of your mind. You don't even... Poems are kind of composed more than written very often anyway, for me. So getting them down on paper actually happens quite late in the process, I think. I'll have a notebook and I'll write a few notes in something when I'm doing it. But actually, it's working it around in my head quite a lot. And sometimes I'll go and try and write deliberately and set aside the time. Either I'll leave the house, actually, go to the pub, cafe, right, or occasionally I'll write in the mornings, first thing. That's kind of on either end of that day, in that sense. And the other thing that I think helps me as a writer is just reading. And I read a lot, and sometimes I try to read. I wish I had more time to read, actually. But to read other poets, but not just poetry, actually, a lot of prose writers as well. Also, just to get used to how people are using words, how they're framing sentences. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I read other writers for their syntax. You know, just wow. So I love some of Cormac McCarthy's novels, and just for a phrase sometimes. And he has that thing, I think there's a rule about it, where he just groups 3 adjectives together.
Yes.
And he just does it so beautifully. There's one in the Crossing where he describes the main character as homeless, hunted, weary. I love the way weary.
That's lovely.
I love the idea that weary is the worst thing.
Yeah.
It comes at the end of that sentence. It's worse than being homeless and hunted. Yeah. It's weary, and so I part of my writing practice is to read a lot. It's actually essential, I think. I can't usually write more. This isn't quite answering your question. It's a bit odd because I've noticed it. Is that when I was younger, when I was kind of young, I was very impatient to get a poem finished and didn't like it if they weren't getting finished. It was kind of like frustrating to me. Now, I feel quite unsettled if I'm not writing, if I haven't got a poem on the go.
How interesting. I was going to ask that.
It's scary, actually.
Yeah, that's it. They're really interesting. Can you tell me, do you have a sense of how long that process is going to be when you set out?
I think there are some poems that will take years. Or not poems. There are phrases that you have that seem to wait around for a long time before you've got the rest of the poem for them to slip into. There are occasionally poems that you know are going to come out fairly quickly, by which I mean a few weeks or something like that, because the impulse behind them was so strong. And I think, I'll read some in a moment, but elegies. I think if you're writing because somebody you know has died, then I think that may not be the last poem you're ever going to write about them.
Yes.
But there's an impulse for that poem to come out.
Yes.
That it has to come out.
A sense of the poem's public function that is located, that has some kind of time limit attached to it.
Yeah.
Or a time description.
That's right. And you need that poem to come out. And I think occasionally, the one that I had for the DURA was just beautifully just came out. I think what I like to do now, if I've got the time, is to have a draft and then just comes out reasonably quickly and then put it away for months.
Yes.
And then come back to it if I can, which is useless if you're doing a course, by the way.
But I was just going to say it's a really lovely thing for our young people to hear, this idea that a poem doesn't need to be drafted and finished in a sitting or in a week or even in a month.
I think there are poets who do work a bit like that, and especially I think if you for commissions, which are slightly different. Not that I have a lot of those, but occasionally you have to come and do something like that. But no, you don't have to write. And you need to write what you need to write, and that's the thing. for me. It's, not writing poetry to earn millions of pounds, so why would you bother trying to write to deadlines that kind of markets or people are imposing on you?
Yes.
It may well be different for other kinds of writing. I'm not trying to put down other kinds of writing because of that, but I think for a lot of poets, this is not a lack of discipline either, for the poem to take its time. It's a matter of being patient with it and patient with yourself.
Yes.
All the time you're still working at it.
Yes.
A poem is a made thing. And so you are working at ways of bringing it into light. Yeah.
I think these are beautiful things for us to attend to and think about, as we continue to struggle under the rampant success of capitalism, where everything comes with a price and a time attached, to know that there are activities that are timeless. Let's have some more poems.
Okay. Well, I mentioned, I do... how long have we got, actually?
Well, I think we'll go. I think we'll talk. I want to have lots of opportunities for questions, and then maybe some reading, some more reading at the end. So
I'll read some poems, a couple of poems. I've mentioned elegies, so I'll do a couple of poems which are elegiac, however you say that word. This was just actually it became years after my father's death. It was just a memory. It's called August. For younger people, I ought to sort of explain a couple of references. Kensington was a brand of cigarette back in the day, and the People was a newspaper. Is the People still going as a newspaper on Sundays? No. It used to be a newspaper on a Sunday. So, the poem's called August. My father is kneeling in a scatter of carrot and potato leaves in the vegetable patch at the back of the garden. He has just flipped the stub of his Kensitus onto the compost heap, and his trowel lies beside him on the dry earth. Soon he will come indoors to drink tea and read the People. But for now he is still, watching the evening's first pipistrelles work the lush, familiar air. So I imagine. It's a poem. My brother Les passed away from cancer 3 years ago now, I think. We would go fishing. He was a few years older than me sometimes. He wasn't that good. I was worse, much worse. One night he took me night fishing at the local lake. Well, I must have been about 12 or something. So this is called Night Fishing. Britain's pond, a July dusk, mayflies hazing the flat brown water as the day's last rooks flowed into the trees, and you threw crusts of mother's pride out among the reeds, where you reckoned the big carp swam like slow, fat kings. A moth-rich summer darkness came. Some mist, grass and bracken scents, train echoes from the bridge across Saltbox Road. But all that cool, unlucky night, our hooks hung weightless, free. I can't remember if we blamed the weather or the bait, or if we said much at all. But I can see you, Les, settled into the shadow of that ridiculously big angler's umbrella, a mug of thermos tea cradled on your lap, while you drew calmly on a player's number 6, as if you'd always known it wasn't about the strike, the catch, and isn't now talking about you in your garden in the April sunlight, these 40 slow years later, these other worlds. I'll do another prosy type of poem, also about my father. Poetic, you may have gathered, it's not a Scottish name, nor an English name. It's a kind of Serbo-Croat Romanian corrupted name. And it's a poem about, my father was from Romania. It's a poem in the 60s, late 60s, 70s, 1970, we made a trip to Romania to see my relatives. Anyway, it's a poem about that. It's called Miles. 19 years after the death of my father, I'm cycling through a crowd of twisted Scots pines on the Sheriff Muir Road, thinking about the family trip to Romania in 1970, and Dad standing in a Timișoara backyard, aunts, cousins, uncles, in-laws fluttering madly about a rough trestle table laden with ham, bread and homemade lemonade. 30 years of war and exile falling away like the petals from the cherry tree, and Dad as deeply calm and happy as I've ever seen him, as if all this din of love were the breeze from the river or the swell of birdsong. And the thought happens that if I could look at myself right now, I'd see a 51-year-old man crisscrossed by pine shadows, crammed full of things to say and sing and speechless. I think the sense of home, which I know you'll appreciate, is something that poets, in the poetry I read, as well as the poetry I write, something that fascinates me. Especially, I think, James Heaney was trying to imagine what home is, and imagine a kind of home that is a model of peace. And so it fascinates me about how we inhabit places, and how animals inhabit places and human beings. And there's a place just up the road from us called Sheriff Muir, which was the scene of a battle in the Jacobite uprising of exactly 300 years ago, I think, about the Sheriff Muir. So it's kind of got a big human history, Sheriff Muir, very bloody one. But when my first experience of Sheriff Muir was in March, when I first came up to Scotland 20 years ago now, just over, and it's full of, there's a lot of lapwings there, and lapwings have this amazing acrobatic aeronautic display at that time of year, sort of like plummet and then pull out at the last minute. So this is a poem called Lapwings at Sheriff Muir. Impossible that the sheer split-second grace of their love dives could end in anything but blood, feather, bone, speckling the wet grass of the killing ground. That they could aim themselves at death, headlong, wings bent, intent as suicides, and at the last moment rise, through thin rain to the low moor sky, crying their lives like nothing on this grave earth. I like lapwings. Shall I read one or two more?
Yeah, two. Let's have two or three more, and then we'll have some questions.
Okay, right. Let's have... I do know the science poem. It's not really a science poem. It begins with the Big Bang. It's called A Moment of Heat. When the universe began, it was small, dark, and pretty, wore its hair up and flashed a winning smile that lasted for all of 1,000 millionth of a second, whereupon it splintered like glass on fire, flew outward and cooled. There are bits of a grin everywhere, so they say. Yet from this event came matter, and from that first hydrogenous matter all other things. Even the sudden involuntary image of my father sitting where I sit now, elbows resting on a restaurant table, watching the evening ferry pull out of the harbour toward the mainland lights. Even the scratched wood surface of the table itself. 2 more. One about a seal, and then I think we'll end with some geese. This seal appeared to me at Ullapool Station. Ullapool Harbour, just by the ferry terminal. The harbour seal. A seal breaks the low swell between marker buoys close to the pier, breathes slow, dribbly breaths. Its skin's a mottled, oily grey, like the winter sky or mildewed glass. And though it's hard to say if the seal's looking up at you or the crowd of prawn boat masts hugging the dock, the small black eyes make you think of rain and how the earth gives itself to rain and darkness and tides. And when the seal dives, the quiet, creel-heaped pier feels suddenly cold and in the past. And this last one, which I'm going to read because on the train up here I could see plenty of geese. There was a field on the way to Perth just full, hundreds and hundreds of geese. They've come back. So this poem is called, when I can find it, October Geese. I'll end with this one. The autumn sun hanging from the branches of an oak hill pine. Across the road, 500 or 600 grey-lag geese pecking the furrowed earth for flecks of stubble. Just days ago, the grey-lag huddled in an Iceland marsh, sunlight breaking on peat-dark pools, snow on the hills. Now the same sun burning in the trees, blue autumn sky, cool wind, the murmur of geese in a ploughed field like prayers heard in a dream. Somebody telling you this, you listening. Thank you.
It's been such a treat talking with you and hearing you read. Can this be one of first of many, many more visits,
I hope so.
please?
I really hope so.
Will you all join with
Thank
me
you.
in thanking Chris Powici?